Hello everyone. Today I'm going to show you my web development project. This project has two parts. One part is when I first started on the project and worked on it for about 3 to 4 months. The next part is when I returned to the project after putting it on hold for a few months. This is going to be a rather long video since I learned so much from this project. There's really a lot to cover, so let's get started. It started with a piece of open source software I found on the internet, and this is the original source code for that software. It's on a blank HTML page and it uses JavaScript and PHP to operate. In order to make this software work, I needed to install a web server that could run PHP, and so I installed a web server called WAMP, which is Windows, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. Since PHP is part of that package, I can add PHP plugins to the page I host, like in this example. This chat box here has been modified quite a bit since I first encountered it. So just for reference, this is the original chat box that is freely available on the internet. It has a powered by link and a donate button. And the first user to join is op, which means you're an administrator. So you can kick people, and I think you can kick yourself. And you can. This blank HTML page is really boring, so of course the first thing I did was add the plugin to a page that I made. This was the first page that I made, and it doesn't really have a lot to offer. It has a paragraph of text and a banner, and then the chat box. None of this is actually original except for the text. The font style and background are things I ripped off from a web page a friend of mine had made, and the banner is obviously not original. It's clearly a ripped off banner. And the chat box is open source, which I only modified slightly. As you can see, the powered by link and donate button are gone. Also, you can see Lonelybot is in the channel, which was one of my very first additions to the page. Since I'm hosting the page, I can log in with two IP addresses. I can log in with my computer's IP address, and I can log in as localhost. This allows me to have two users in the chat box. I decided to use one user to monitor the chat box and use the other for when I'm actually at my computer. Having Lonelybot always logged in allowed me to keep track of everything happening in the channel. Whenever a new user logged in, it would be recorded on Lonelybot's page. If someone decided to leave a message with Lonelybot in the channel, I would be able to go back and read it later. Since people could get to my page using my IP address, I kind of thought of my IP address as the phone number for my computer, and Lonelybot was like my answering machine. Having Lonelybot in the channel without my other username was a pretty good indication that I wasn't available, but I didn't think most people who had never been to the page before would actually know that. It seemed necessary to leave some instructions for when I wasn't at my computer. But I didn't really want those instructions on the page when I was here, so I ended up creating two different pages, one for when I was online and one for when I was not. This is the other page I created, which was called Lonely Chat, which was named for Lonelybot, who took my messages, as he sat in the chat room all day by himself. Originally, changing between the pages was done manually. I kept a copy of each page and pasted them to my web server's index folder. But I quickly grew tired of doing that and shortly after created some Windows batch files which would copy and paste the appropriate page to the index folder when I double-clicked them. Using the batch files, I could quickly change between which page would display when someone visited my IP address. Originally, I could only run the batch files when I was at my computer, but later I wanted to make it possible to run the batch files from a remote computer. This would allow someone else to change the page and act as an alternate host. It wasn't actually necessary to change the page to do this, but I thought it might be fun and a nice challenge. I created another page on the server and started my first experiments with PHP. To clarify, PHP is a server-side language. In the example of the chat box, my computer is the server and everyone connected to it is the client. PHP can't run code on a client computer, but it can run code on my computer. PHP can perform tasks such as creating files, reading files, writing to files, and running programs, which means it could run my batch files. A single line of PHP code is all that's needed to run the batch files. This page has been changed since it was first created, but originally it contained a link to two different PHP pages. One page would open the chat page, and one would close it. I later changed the page to remove the links because it allowed people to run code on the server without authentication. Anyone could get to this page if they knew the address. I also found better ways to change the page later on. Further experiments with PHP led to the creation of two more pages. One was a fake server crash page which would ask for a command to restart the server, and the other was a suggestion box where people could submit suggestions about how my website could be improved. Both these pages use similar code to perform the same task. That task was sending data from an HTML page to a PHP page to be processed. When the data was submitted, it was saved to a file. These pages gave me my first look at HTML requests, which is a method for sending data between web pages. There's quite a few ways to do this, and in this example I used the methods provided by HTML5. Later I would learn to use other methods for making HTML requests to send more sophisticated data, but at the time there was still plenty of code left for me to explore, and development moved on to other areas. While I was studying web development, I was also posting a link to Facebook with the address to my page. Essentially, I was hosting a nightly chat that was available to my Facebook friends. Although the original open page stayed the same, the closed page was changed quite a bit, allowing me to explore HTML a little bit more, and I posted content inspired by my regular users. The reason I edited the closed page was to give people something to read when I wasn't there. This is the page after its many additions. I added a contact email which was supplied by one of my users. I also added a message saying when the chat room would be available next, which was frequently updated. I also added a list of users who frequented the page, adding their descriptions and some additional content, usually a picture or YouTube video. This was a pretty basic exercise in adding content to an HTML page. Some of the more advanced additions to the page was a live video link from Twitch TV, which is a link to one of my friend's live streams that can be viewed on the page. It's added using embed code similar to a YouTube video. I also had my own account at one point, but I was banned for using it to stream YouTube videos instead of video game footage. Although I found a different way to play YouTube videos, it was my only option at the time until I got banned. This page also contains my first ever use of JavaScript in a secret button that's hidden on the page. When someone viewing the page clicks the secret button, it will display a hidden YouTube video, and the button can be clicked again to hide the video. Apart from this use of JavaScript, no other advanced coding is done on the page. Since the chat box uses JavaScript, I decided to explore JavaScript by editing the chat box rather than the HTML page. I decided to focus my JavaScript development around Lonelybot. I thought it would be cool to make Lonelybot a little more functional by making him talk. With my limited knowledge of JavaScript at the time, this was not very easy to do. The first task in making him talk was fetching the data in the chat box to process the messages. After many tries, I was unable to figure out how to capture only the last message that was sent. All I could figure out how to do was return the entire contents of the chat box as one long string. Although I was aware this was certainly not the best way to read the chat box, I decided it was possible to read the messages by parsing the string back into its containing elements. I could find the username posting the message and the message posted within the string and store them as variables using a parsing engine that I built. It took several tries to get the engine to parse the data correctly, and it was somewhat prone to error, but I was able to capture the messages to be processed. Once the messages were read, having Lonelybot post messages was quite easy. The chat box contains a built-in function for posting messages from JavaScript, and shortly after the parsing engine was completed, Lonelybot was able to talk. I then improved Lonelybot's functionality further by having him run commands on the page. The first command was simple JavaScript to reload the page. This was useful for when I edited the page as HTML and wanted it to appear on the other pages of other users. The next commands were to open and close the chat, which meant I needed to learn a new way to send an HTTP request. I couldn't use HTML5 to send a request from JavaScript directly. I could make the open and close links from my page available on the chat box or on the chat page as hidden buttons and have JavaScript click them, but I decided this method wasn't going to work forever as my needs for sending requests was only likely to increase from here. The solution was to use Ajax, which is a much better way to send requests in HTML5 because many different data types can be sent, which was going to be useful later on. Another addition to the chat box that used this method was an image button that would allow users to post images to the chat box. This button was not the nicest solution for doing this, but it did work. The button would prompt the user for an image URL, and then send a link to a PHP page on the server, which would save it to a file. The page would then post an image message on the chat box, and the client pages would read that tag and read the URL from the server and inject the image. This method has some limitations. For example, there was only one text file to contain the image URL. Only one person could post an image at a time. This led me to creating an authentication system where only some users would have this button available. Around this time, I also added a command for Lonelybot, which allowed Lonelybot to post a YouTube video, and it would play the video on all the client pages in a separate window. Also around this time, I found that my link on Facebook was not getting much attention. I was having quite a bit of trouble enticing new users with the promise of a simple chat box. So I went looking for ways to increase the page's functionality to offer more features than just group chat. This led me to finding a different web server program which had a look and feel that was somewhat similar to Facebook, which is what most people are accustomed to using. On this web server, users are able to create their own posts, but it's not quite the same as Facebook. Rather than posting text and links, users can post files, which will be uploaded to the server. Originally, I planned to modify the page to make it a little more user-friendly and then tie it into my other page, but I ended up using it to upload my own pages to do some tests with jQuery, which I found to be much easier to use than standard JavaScript. After a while, I got tired of posting links to the site on Facebook, and the site had fewer visitors. Eventually, Lonelybot broke down and would no longer stay in the channel. My computer needed an overhaul, and I had to reinstall Windows. I decided to put the project on hold and started working on other projects. But after a few months, I had people asking me about the page and whether it would be back, so I decided to do some upgrading to the original project and put it back online. After learning jQuery, this project became much easier to work with. My first upgrade was getting rid of the parsing engine, which never worked quite like it was supposed to. Looking at the code with my new knowledge of jQuery, I found it very easy to select the last message sent. The parsing engine I built originally took over a week and a half of trial and error to work, but rebuilding the function with jQuery only took about 10 minutes. The next update I made was on the close page when it says, "Who punched in yesterday?" In the original project, I edited this section of the page every day by hand. I ended up with quite a long list of usernames that I had commented out when they were no longer active on the channel. So not only was I keeping the page up to date, I was also keeping track of all the usernames that had been used in the channel. If I was going to relaunch the page, I didn't want to keep doing this job by hand. Now when Lonelybot loads his page, he starts keeping a list of usernames who have entered the channel. At the end of the day, this list is saved to a file on the server. That file is now what is used to display the names listed in the Who Punched In section of the close page. In order to keep my list of all the usernames used in the channel, Lonelybot will also test every new login name against a list saved on the server, and add new names to the list that have never been used before. In the first version of the project, nearly all the development focused on building on top of the chat box rather than actually modifying the chat box itself. Apart from removing the extra buttons and changing administrators to grandmasters, the actual source code from the chat box hadn't been edited to add new features. New features such as the image button were added to work around the chat box by appending code to the page using a script of my own. When I came back to work on the page, I really wanted to take another look at the source code to see if I could do modifications to the chat box directly. I started with the image button to see if I could make it a built-in feature. In order to make it a built-in function, the client pages need to be able to send an image URL to the chatbox server, and then the chatbox has to post the image or post the URL as an image to all the client computers. After studying the source code for the chatbox, I noticed that each message contains a type attribute, which was used to process command messages. The chatbox would process messages depending on their type. So I decided to create a new type of message called image that could be sent to the chat server. I then had to find the function that received messages from the server and tell it how to handle this message type. Normally the chat box will append any message to make it so any HTML code will display as a string rather than adding the HTML to the page. If I remove the code that appends the messages, any form of HTML can be sent to the server and be displayed as HTML on the client side. I don't always want to make it possible for clients to post HTML code, so I modified the code to only append messages that aren't of the image type. This restrains HTML posting for use with images. When you click the button, it will prompt you for an image URL. The function for the button will then generate an HTML image tag and set its source to the link of the image. When the HTML tag is posted to the chat server, it will be processed as an image type, meaning it will read it as HTML and display the HTML image tag, allowing users to post images through the chat box. This is a much better way to post images than my previous attempt. In the original project, I had experimented with adding fake users to the channel by modifying the user list from the client page and posting fake messages to the chat box from the client page's script. This did create the illusion that there was a new user in the channel. However, all this code was run on the client page, and so it didn't appear on Lonelybot's page because he only received messages from the server. This could be corrected by making sure the fake message was also posted on Lonelybot's server-side page as well, but this method had some limitations. The greatest of these was that the messages had to be posted in a predictable way to make sure it would appear the same for all users on the page. If, for example, the fake user posted messages that were randomly generated, every page would get a different message because each page was running its own script. The only way to make a randomly generated response appear on all pages was to send the message through the chat box so every page would receive it the same way. Sending a new message type like an image is rather easy because only the chatbox jQuery code needs to be edited. But in order to add a fake user to the chatbox's PHP code also needs to be edited. The original source code did not include any functions for adding fake users to the chat. Adding Lonelybot to the channel was easy because he's a real user with a real page and a real IP address. Each new user to join the channel will have an ID generated by the PHP code, and the details about that user will be appended to it. Attributes such as name, role, and what channel they're in will be generated for each new user logging in. To create a fake user, I needed to create a new route in the PHP code that will tell it to generate a new user ID and add it to the channel. After the ID is generated and added to the channel, the chat box will treat the new ID as a new user, but it will only last so long before timing out. This is because each user has a keep alive flag, which is set to true every time a user's page checks for pending messages. A real user's page will check for messages once every 60 or 70 milliseconds or so. A fake user won't have their own page, so they won't check for messages, and there will be nothing to reset their alive flag. To keep the user in the channel, I needed to create another route in the PHP code that allows Lonelybot to set the alive flag for other users in the channel. This way, whenever a fake user is added, Lonelybot will set their alive flag whenever he resets his, which will keep the users in the channel as long as Lonelybot is connected. Since Lonelybot is always in the channel, the fake users will stay connected until I choose to remove them. Adding support for bots to the chat box is much better than modifying the list from the client page. My original attempt could only add fake users to a fake list on startup. if I were to try to add a user during the chat or remove one that was already there, the fake user list would return to however it started whenever anyone were to reload the page. This would potentially cause errors if I tried to remove a user that wasn't there, or posted as users that didn't exist on the list. With the bots built into the chat box, they can be added or removed, and client users will always have the updated list whenever they load the page. Although I abandoned the idea of using a fake list to add fake users, I did still like the separate list for bots on the channel, and decided to make that a built-in feature as well. Modifying both the PHP and jQuery code for the chat box was necessary to do this. Originally, the chat box had two lists called users and administrators. Each user ID has a role attribute that can either be user or admin. This attribute is how the chat box knows which list to put the user in. To create a new list, I needed to have it create a new list on startup. Then I created a new role called bot, and set the jQuery to put any user with this role in the bot list. Finally, I created a new PHP code to allow user IDs to be generated that would have this role. Apart from modifying the chat box, I also modified how it looked by creating a new theme. The chat box can be modified to have new themes by changing the chat box's CSS code. By default, the chat box comes with a number of different CSS files that can be used to change the theme. I decided to take one of their examples and modify it a little bit to have it more suited for the look I wanted. I also made it so I could switch between themes by issuing commands to Lonelybot. I also added a defaults file to the server so that the theme of the chat box will be saved when it's changed, and the page will load the theme from that file to keep it consistent with all users joining the channel if the theme has been changed. Otherwise, if I change the theme with someone in the channel, they could always reload the original theme by reloading the page, which means I would have to change it for everyone again if just one person wanted the same theme as everyone else. Another feature I added to the page was a notification message in the title bar that will tell you when there's a new message if you navigated away to another page on the browser. Since the original page didn't have this feature, it was a common problem for people to navigate to another page and never return believing there were no new messages, only to find they missed an entire conversation. The notification message also has an optional notification sound. Although I don't expect to really need it, I added some administration functions to the page as well. The original chat box had a built-in command to kick people from the page, but it doesn't do much good since people can rejoin the page simply by hitting the refresh button on their browser. I programmed a command for Lonelybot that will raise a semi-transparent curtain over the chat. This will still allow people to see the chat, but they won't be able to type anything. This feature won't ban people from the page, but it will force them to log in with a new username. This will require them to log out and wait several minutes for their current session to expire before they can return to the login screen. I can ban someone permanently using their IP address, but since I don't expect this will be needed and the code would be so easy to add to the page, I can just add this code when and if it is ever needed. When I was looking through the source code for the chat box, it seems that at some point it was able to create accounts that were secured with passwords, and you would be prompted to type a password as well as a username. Personally, I like the convenience of not having to use a password to log in, although there are some problems with having every account be a public account, especially since certain accounts have special features and options. I added a little bit of administrative code to lock my username so it can only be accessed by my IP address. This will make sure no one else can log in under my name and run commands on the page or try to pretend to be me. I've never had anyone log in with a name that wasn't theirs, but I might add more locks like this for other users just in case. I plan to allow customized settings for certain users at some point, so it might be nice for the accounts to have some security. Apart from having access to the image upload button, privileged users are also able to access the backlog as soon as they log in. Lonelybot records the chat log every day and resets it every morning. Anyone with the backlog privilege will be able to see everything Lonelybot has recorded since the start of the day. This will keep them from missing the conversation if they are having connection problems and are temporarily disconnected from the channel. Both the open page and closed page now contain a music player that can play music on the page. This is accomplished through the use of a hidden YouTube video. Right now it can only play one song with a specific command from Lonelybot, but I did add functions to change the song on the player and to stop the playback. These functions aren't actually implemented on the page, but can be accessed if I have Lonelybot inject some HTML buttons into the chat. As a bit of an experiment, I added a PHP-powered emailer to the server, which allows Lonelybot to send emails and text messages. He can send me a text message when a new user logs in, and send a transcript of the chat box to my email if they left any messages. This allows me to monitor the chat box when I'm away from my computer, and might also be useful for inviting regular users to the channel by being able to send messages to their phone directly to the chat box. Directly from the chat box, rather. Of course, to have features like that, I would need users to register their phone numbers and email addresses with the server, and I think I'm a ways off from doing anything like that yet. Most of the features I added to the upgraded version were just to smooth over some of the features from the first project that were either incomplete or didn't work correctly, as well as automating more tasks with Lonelybot to make it easier to manage the site when it was relaunched. I still plan to do what I did last time and continue to develop the page as I'm hosting it, adding new features as I go along and doing more experiments to test my abilities as a web developer. The last time I hosted the site, I had several returning users, which was good. I'm hoping to have more users this time around, and hopefully visitors will like the page and all the work that I did will pay off. That's all I have on this project for now, so thanks for watching.